If you grew up near the Appalachian Mountains, you already know. Folks don't just make up stories out here, they remember them. I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. It's wild how many of us are sitting in the dark, listening to the same story, scattered across different corners of the country. Hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people find their way into these woods, whether they should or not. Let's start. I was 35 when I left my teaching job and moved back to Virginia, though back wasn't quite right. My family had never lived in the mountains themselves, but my mother used to tell me we had roots there, old cousins buried on nameless ridges, marriages recorded in churches that rotted long before I was born. After my divorce, I started chasing the notion of solitude. No one asked me to, and no one would miss me if I was gone for a while. So I took contract work surveying environmental damage for a small firm out of Roanoke. Most of it involved driving to remote sites after storms, logging down trees, flooding, or signs of erosion so the company could build a county. I liked it. Out there, the air pressed differently against your lungs, heavy but clean. My assignments took me through scattered parts of Lee and Wise County, the borderland where Virginia tilts into Kentucky. The ridges were sharper here than in the Smokies, the hollows deeper, like someone had cut the land with a dull knife. It wasn't unusual to lose cell service for an entire day. I carried a compass, a laminated set of quadrangle maps, and an emergency beacon the company insisted on. One storm rolled through in late spring, tearing shingles off roofs and dropping whole maples across dirt lanes. A day later, my supervisor called with a job. Hike into a watershed near Pine Gap. Check on a water line that supposedly served a cluster of homes hidden in the folds of the hills. He warned me another surveyor had gone halfway up the route and turned back. The man's notes just said, path blocked. Local access unclear. I asked, unclear how? He only said, not worth spooking yourself over. Just finish the check. That was the sort of reassurance bosses are best at. The morning I drove out, the 2-lane highway narrowed until brush smacked both sides of my truck. Abandoned barns slouched against the tree line, their roofs collapsed into rib cages of splintered beams. I passed a bus with no wheels, its paint faded to bare metal, sitting 50 feet back in the weeds. Nobody lived out here anymore, I thought. Or if they did, they didn't want anyone knowing. At a fork in the track, I pulled over and unloaded the ATV. The map showed the pipeline's pressure valve a mile beyond where the trail broke down to little more than deer track. I strapped on my pack, clipped the radio to my vest, and walked. The forest here was different from the Blue Ridge trails I knew from day hikes. There was no cheerful signage, no switchbacks carved by Park Service rangers. The path twisted like an afterthought, and every step sank into black loam that smelled sweet and wet, as if the ground never dried. My boots crackled through carpets of leaves untouched for decades. After maybe 40 minutes, I crested a low rise and expected to see metal, pipe housing, maybe a small utility shack. Instead, I found footprints. They cut sharp into the soil, the edges not yet weathered. Bare feet, the toes splayed wide, the prints deep as if the walker carried something heavy. They led downhill toward a hollow that wasn't drawn on my map. I followed, against the little voice in my chest begging not to. The slope pitched so steep I had to clutch roots to steady myself. Rocks slid beneath me. I half-skidded the last 20 feet and came out before a clearing. At the center stood a structure. It wasn't quite a cabin, not anymore. 3 walls sagged inward, the 4th collapsed entirely. Logs blackened with rot. Ivy gripped what was left of the roof. But against the rear wall, propped carefully like a shrine, was a length of pipe and valve housing, the exact equipment I'd been sent to check. It looked freshly hauled, mud still clinging where it had scraped along the ground. For a long time, I only stared. Why would anyone drag it down here? The open doorway yawned like a throat. Against my better sense, I stepped inside. The air carried that sour tang of mildew and animal bedding. Slats of sunlight broke through holes overhead, revealing dust motes that swirled with my every movement. The floor sagged underfoot. I crouched near the pipe assembly. The fittings weren't broken or ripped. The seals had been unscrewed carefully. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. That's when I heard the sound. Above me, slow and deliberate, came the thud of footsteps. Step. Pause. Drag. I froze. The building had no second floor. nothing but rafters and moss-eaten beams. Yet the rhythm continued overhead, steady and heavy, as though something carried its weight from one side of the roof to the other. I cleared my throat. "Hello!" My voice cracked in the stale air. "Survey team, just checking equipment." The noise stopped. The silence pressed harder than the footsteps had. I edged toward the door, and that's when I noticed the wall beside it. The logs were shredded. Not carved letters or symbols, but thousands of overlapping gashes, like something had clawed endlessly without breaking through. The wood looked as though it had been unraveling for years. I was halfway through the door when I saw him. He stood 20 yards out, half hidden in shadow, barefoot, skin pale as uncooked dough. His clothing was stitched from hides and rags, hung loosely like it might slide off his frame. His hair matted in ropes across his shoulders. He didn't blink, didn't move, only stared with an intensity that scraped my nerves raw. "I'm leaving," I said, raising my palms. That's when another figure stepped from behind the first. Broader, shoulders rounded, dressed the same way. Then a third. They didn't rush or shout. They only stood, as though waiting for me to step back inside the cabin. I turned toward the ridge, forcing myself not to sprint, though every instinct screamed at me. My boots cracked twigs, and behind me new footsteps joined in. Slow at first, matching me. Then closer. When a branch snapped directly at my back, I broke. I ran blind uphill, branches clawing my arms, moss slipping beneath my boots. My chest burned with each breath, but I kept clawing upward. The forest filled with sound, footsteps crashing through leaves, brush snapping under weight. Not running, but always behind me, always close enough I felt the hair on my neck rise. When the trees finally thinned and I glimpsed the ATV, I nearly wept. I vaulted onto the seat, turned the key, and roared the engine alive. Gravel spit behind me as I tore down the trail. I didn't check the mirrors. I didn't want to know. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, where my radio finally caught a signal. My hands shook as I reported everything: equipment stolen, people on site, unsafe conditions. They told me to file it back at the office. Days later, I cornered my supervisor. "So who's going out to recover the valve?" He didn't even pretend. He sighed, rubbed his eyes, and said, "We're rerouting the line. That area, it's best left alone." That was all. No follow-up. No sheriff's report. Just silence. I tried to return once, weeks later, if only to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. But the trail split differently than before. The hollow was gone, replaced by unbroken forest, the ridge reshaped as though the land itself had changed overnight. And yet I know what I saw. That cabin wasn't shelter. It wasn't some hermit's den. It was bait. The equipment had been dragged there not for theft, but for lure. To draw someone like me, a stranger with no reason to be missed until nightfall. Sometimes, when I dream, I still hear that measured rhythm. Step, pause, drag, and I wake with the taste of soil in my mouth, as though I'd been sleeping under the mountain, waiting for the next one to follow the map where it bends wrong. I was 32 the year I decided I'd had enough of office walls and fluorescent lights. My degree was in geology, but all it had earned me was a cubicle in a municipal planning department and a boss who measured productivity by how long your bathroom breaks lasted. I told myself I was quitting to reconnect with the land, though in truth I was running from a marriage that had dissolved into long silences and cold dinners. Surveying parcels for out-of-state buyers seemed like a clean break. The money wasn't great, but the freedom appealed. If you're alone in the woods long enough, no one expects you to answer to anything but the trees. That's how I ended up in Laurel County, Kentucky, tracing the old ridges along the edge of Daniel Boone National Forest. I rented a cheap cabin outside London, little more than a hunting shack with plumbing bolted on, and started picking up private surveying jobs. Most were straightforward: mark property boundaries, check for encroachments, map slopes. The kind of work no one notices until it's wrong. One call came from a man named Jacob Dillard. His grandfather had left him a section of land deep inside an area called Tinsley Branch, which sat between two ridgelines where the maps blurred into guesswork. Dillard said he didn't want the land, too far gone, too overgrown, but he figured it might be worth something if he had a certified survey. He spoke quickly, like he wanted the job done, but didn't want to talk about it. I should have asked why, but the truth is I needed the paycheck. The first day out there felt normal. Hot, humid, the air heavy enough to drink. The ATV got me within half a mile before the trail collapsed into root tangles and red clay gullies. I spent most of the afternoon marking northern points, climbing in and out of old fence lines half buried in vines. The woods weren't exactly quiet. Crows argued overhead, cicadas droned, but there was a strange absence of deer tracks or rabbit scat. For Kentucky backcountry, that was unusual. I noticed other things too. Trees grew in odd arcs, as if bent by years of pressure, all angling away from the hollow's center. Not broken by storms, grown that way. I chalked it up to soil or slope conditions, but my gut kept pricking at me. The second day, I decided to cut in from the south ridge, where the old Platte suggested an outbuilding might have stood. There wasn't much of a trail, just a thin animal path. The woods grew tighter, shadows stretching even before noon. About an hour in, I broke into a clearing I swear wasn't on any aerial maps I'd studied. At its center stood a cabin, not collapsed or ancient, but eerily preserved. Shingle roof intact, glass still in the windows, porch swept clean of leaves. A water bucket sat by the steps half filled with clear rainwater, and stacked firewood leaned neatly against the siding. Rabbit hutches, empty but scrubbed, lined one wall. It looked lived in, and yet no sound, no smoke, no truck. I stayed behind the tree-line, heart hammering. Rule number 1 in hollers like this: never walk up on a stranger's cabin uninvited. Out here, people valued privacy more than law. But just as I turned to skirt around, it happened. 3 knocks. Not from the door, but deep within the cabin's walls. Solid, measured, deliberate. The sound landed inside me like a mallet striking bone. Whoever was in there wanted me to know I'd been seen. I backed away slow, eyes locked on the windows, waiting for a curtain twitch or a shadow. Nothing. Just stillness. I took the long route out, wading a creek bed and climbing back to the ridge with lungs on fire. That night I sat in my rented shack with every curtain closed, a mug of coffee going cold in my hands, replaying those knocks. Purposeful. Not startled, not curious. Like they were inviting me. I told myself I wouldn't go back. But the job wasn't finished, and stubbornness is a sickness. The next morning I parked farther away, determined to avoid the clearing entirely. Around midday, climbing along a slope choked with laurel thickets, I saw it. A deer, hanging upside down by its hind legs from a branch. Rope cut deep into the flesh. Its rib cage had been cracked open wide, not field-dressed, but wrenched apart, sternum shattered, insides emptied. Blood darkened the fur to near black. The stench hit like rotten copper and spoiled meat. Hunters can be brutal, but this wasn't hunting. This was display. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me. But I pressed on, fast and careless, stabbing marker flags into the ground without double-checking coordinates. That's when the footsteps started. Light, deliberate. Circling. Whoever it was didn't charge or sneak. They paced around me in a perfect arc, crunching leaves, then pausing. My heart hammered. I crouched low behind a fallen log, shut off the GPS unit. The steps completed a loop, then silence. Until the scraping began. Metal on bark, long and slow, as though someone dragged a blade against a tree trunk. Once. Twice. Deliberate. Then nothing. I bolted. Branches slashed my arms, roots tripped my boots, but I didn't stop until I burst onto the gravel road, chest heaving, throat raw. My hands shook too badly to start the truck. When I finally got it running, I drove straight to town, left my gear in the woods, and filed a partial report blaming terrain difficulty. Nobody questioned it. Maybe they knew better than to ask. That night, sleep broke me open at 3 a.m. A sound tapped against my trailer window. Soft, steady, same rhythm as the cabin knocks. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, counting each beat. Finally it stopped. I dared to peek through the curtain. A figure stood at the tree-line, tall, bare-chested, holding something upright in his hand. Moonlight caught the shape. It was one of my survey poles, the kind I'd abandoned in the forest. He didn't wave or move closer, just stood, pale skin gleaming, head cocked as though waiting. After several long minutes, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I left Laurel County before the week ended. Took only my clothes and notebooks, let the landlord keep the deposit. I live in Lexington now, where the worst thing I hear at night is a drunk yelling over parking. I still do survey work, but only in city blocks. Places with lights, sidewalks, neighbors. I told myself it was just people, backwoods squatters marking territory. But deep down I know it wasn't. My grandmother used to whisper about the Ridge Watchers, old stories she half laughed at when I was a kid. She said they lived where the hollows fold too tight for sunlight, people who stayed behind when the land itself shifted. She claimed the trees leaned away from them, that animals fled their shadows, that they watched the living until the living wandered too close. I don't know if she believed it, but I remember her saying one thing clearly. They don't hunt food. They hunt company. When I close my eyes, I still hear those knocks. Not random, not curious. An invitation, waiting for the next fool to follow a map into a place that doesn't want to be found. I was 38 when I left a steady construction job in Charleston and signed on as a seasonal fire spotter in the Monongahela National Forest of West Virginia. Most folks thought I was crazy, trading a paycheck and steady work for a cot in a shack 40 feet off the ground with no plumbing. But solitude felt like salvation at the time. My marriage had just imploded, and I wasn't much good at being around people anyway. Out here, in the ridges and folds where radio static was sometimes the only voice you heard all week, I figured the quiet would stitch me back together. The first season went fine. Long days staring at the tree line, charting lightning strikes, noting storm damage. Nights with a lantern, a paperback, and the endless drone of insects. You'd be surprised how comforting the sound of crickets becomes when you're starved for human voices. The second year is when things started. It was mid-October, the air crisp enough that your breath clung long in the dusk. Dispatch relayed a call from a hunter in Randolph County. He'd stumbled on what looked like a wrecked campsite in a drainage south of Bear Heaven Overlook. He said the tent had been torn wide open, belongings scattered. No blood, but everything shredded beyond recognition. He hiked out fast, left a GPS pin, and reported it once he had service. They sent me because I was already closest. It was nearly 4 p.m. when I shouldered my pack and started down the old service road. Sunset bleeds fast in those valleys, and I knew I'd be pushing it, but the job was just to confirm the damage and tape it off for investigation. The trail dropped sharp, switchbacks carved decades ago when loggers still ran the ridges. Leaves slicked the ground, and every step rattled loose gravel downhill. By the time I reached the GPS coordinates, the last light was draining behind the ridge. The sight was worse than I'd pictured. The tent was in ribbons, one entire wall shredded to dangling strips. A sleeping bag had been dragged halfway out, the zipper torn, stuffing strewn like feathers after a fox raid. The pack lay 20 feet away, its contents ripped open, not stolen, just destroyed. Even the wrappers from granola bars had been shredded into tiny squares, like someone had the patience to ruin everything, but no interest in keeping it. I crouched, swept the beam of my headlamp across the soil. Boot prints led downhill. Size 11 maybe, sunk deep on one side like whoever it was limped or had been pulled. They ran for 30-40 yards. Then stopped. Not faded. Stopped mid-stride. One last print, then nothing. I've seen bad storms wipe tracks quick. I've seen moss and pine needles make prints vanish after a few yards. But this was bare ground. Leaf litter all around, undisturbed. It was like the earth itself refused to record anything further. I raised my radio to call it in when a sound threaded through the trees. A whistle. 3 notes. Thin, high, deliberate. Too measured to be birdsong. Too steady to be wind through branches. It didn't echo the way sound normally does in the hollows. It just hung like it was close no matter where you stood. I froze, radio half raised. Then I said, "Park service. Is someone injured out here?" The whistle stopped. I held my breath, headlamp sweeping the trees, heart stuttering in my chest. I took one step back toward the tent. Another. The whistle came again. Same 3 notes. But this time behind me. I spun, light shaking over underbrush. Nothing but the endless dark pressing between tree trunks. Static hissed over my radio. At first I thought it was a loose connection. Then I realized I was hearing breathing. Slow, heavy, directly into the channel. A voice rasped through, low and clear. "You shouldn't have followed." I nearly dropped the radio. My throat closed. My mind went blank except for the single command, "Leave." I ran. Branches clawed my arms, rocks slipped under my boots. The beam of my lamp jerked wildly as I tore uphill. Every snap of brush behind me echoed like pursuit. I didn't look back, didn't care if I fell. I just ran until the trees broke and the gravel of the service road crunched under me. I reached my truck slick with sweat, hands trembling so badly I missed the ignition twice. I slammed the locks down, flicked on every exterior light, and sat there gripping the wheel like I meant to break it off. Backup arrived nearly an hour later and found me wide-eyed, rifle unslung, staring into the tree line. The next morning, I led a pair of rangers back in daylight. Only there was nothing to lead them to. The tent? Gone. The shredded pack? Gone. Even the tape I'd tied around a sapling was missing. Not snapped, not blown loose, just gone. The ground looked untouched, no footprints, no drag marks. Like the woods had erased the whole scene. We stood in silence, pretending we weren't rattled. On the log I filed it as possible vandalism, no confirmed victim. And I tried to let it go. But 2 weeks later it came back. I was on fire watch duty at one of the older towers, Hawk's Nest. A 40-foot timber frame with a wraparound deck. Beautiful views of the Cheat River Gorge on clear days. That night, though, clouds smothered the moon and the dark was thick as tar. Sometime after midnight, my radio clicked alive. Static at first, then that same slow breathing. "You shouldn't have followed," the voice rasped again. I shot upright, grabbed the rifle from beside my cot, and swept the tower windows. Nothing but the dark. Then the whistle began. 3 notes. Same cadence. Only now it was coming from directly below the tower. My hands shook as I fumbled the spotlight on. I leaned over the rail, beam stabbing into the clearing. Something stood at the base. Too tall. Shoulders hunched forward, skin as pale as candle wax stretched thin. Its head tilted back until the neck looked ready to snap, and its eyes caught the light. Not eyes exactly. Just black. Flat, liquidless, reflecting nothing. And then it smiled. The mouth opened far too wide, teeth small and countless, crowding over each other like fish scales. I stumbled back, slammed the hatch door, and dropped the lock bar across it. I sat all night with my back against the trap, rifle across my lap, forcing myself not to blink. At dawn, there was nothing below. No tracks. No sign. I filed for medical leave that morning, told them I was sick. Packed a bag, drove 10 hours west to my brother's in Ohio. Haven't set foot in Monongahela since. But I dream. God, I dream. In the dreams I'm back in that tower, radio hissing with static. The voice whispers not "you shouldn't have followed, but we've been waiting for you." And when I wake, I swear I still hear the whistle, faint and steady, drifting just outside my window. Old-timers around Parsons used to warn about the whistler of the gorge. A story I'd laughed at when they first told it. A pale figure who drew the lost deeper with 3 notes and erased their traces after. They said the forest didn't just hide bodies, it consumed memory itself. I believe them now, and I keep the radio I carried that night tucked in a box in my closet. Sometimes, when the house is still, I click it on. Static. Breathing. 3 notes. Always the same. Always waiting. I was 34 when I took the job with a regional energy company that handled remote relay stations in the mountains of southern West Virginia. Before that, I'd worked a string of odd trades, mechanic, HVAC, even a stint in retail management, but nothing had ever stuck. What appealed about this gig was simple. It got me away from people. I'd been raised in Logan County, where you either stayed or you ran off to the city and never came back. I stayed, though most of my friends didn't. By the time the offer came through, my marriage was already broken and my evenings were spent in silence. A job where I was expected to spend 12 hours at a time alone on ridges no one else cared about felt more like refuge than labor. My primary post was a communications repeater on Brush Mountain, a monster of rusted beams, jury-rigged panels, and humming steel. It wasn't glamorous, climbing, calibrating, swapping out fried boards, but the equipment tied together power lines and emergency channels across 3 counties. If it failed, people noticed. Which meant, like it or not, so did I. The access road wound 6 miles from the valley floor up into trees, so thick you forgot the color of the sky halfway up. Once you passed the second switchback, no cell signal, no radio chatter. Just you, the metal groaning above, and the forest leaning tight around the road. I got used to it, too used, maybe. The kind of stillness that works its way under your ribs until you start craving it. Last November, though, something shifted. It started with the readings. A trickle of malformed signals, tiny packets pinging the tower with no headers, no origin, like fragments of something trying to speak, but not knowing the language. I forwarded them to the office in Charleston. They sent back a shrug, probably stray telemetry, wildlife collars, maybe experimental beacons. Not my problem, but I couldn't let it go. 3 days later, on the ride up, I saw it. A strip of cloth, bright red, knotted to a hickory branch at the side of the trail. Not survey tape, not forestry marking. Too neatly tied, edges too clean. The next morning, there was another, lower, looped around the trunk of a young oak. The day after that, a third, half hidden among rhododendron, like it had been placed there to test whether I was looking closely enough. By the fifth one, I couldn't dismiss them as coincidence. They weren't evenly spaced, not forming a path, but they tugged me off the road in subtle steps, coaxing me deeper down the slope where no tracks or bottles or shells littered the ground. I'd worked these ridges long enough to know where hunters went, where kids camped, where deer trails carved the soil. This wasn't any of those. I counted 9 in all, each leading into darker thickets. After the last one, I caught the smell. It wasn't rot. It wasn't animal musk. It was cloying chemical like burnt sugar mixed with motor oil. It made my throat tighten and my eyes sting. And yet I kept moving downhill until the ground cupped into a shallow basin. There was a camp. At first glance it looked abandoned, a sagging canvas tent, seams rotted, half swallowed by earth. Around it, rusted cans, a dented pan, a plastic jug clouded with black residue. But what froze me were the bones. They'd been arranged. Circles, lines, spirals pressed into the dirt. Small skeletons, raccoon, rabbit, maybe cats, bleached or charred, some lashed together with strands of red thread. Bundled like toys. Too precise to be trash, too deliberate to be accident. I stood there a long time, phone shaking as I took a photo before backing out. That's when I realized 2 of the cloth markers I'd passed were gone. Not dropped, not fallen, gone, as if they'd never been tied at all. I wasn't lost. I knew the slope, knew the trees, but when I tried retracing my steps, I found only a single piece of red string lying frayed on the soil, edges sheared as if sliced. My hands trembled the whole climb back up. The ATV wouldn't start. Not dead, not drained, just lifeless, as though the spark inside it had been smothered. I pushed it 2 miles downhill, swearing under my breath the whole way until the first bars of service blinked back onto my phone. I called my cousin Caleb. He didn't ask questions, just came with his truck, loaded the machine, and drove me home in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bundles of bones tied neat with yarn. The next morning, stubbornness, or pride, dragged me back. I brought my rifle this time, slung across my back, and told myself I was just verifying what I'd seen. But the clearing was empty. No tent, no bones, no smell, just raw dirt raked and smoothed, as if something had been dragged slowly away, taking its time, erasing itself. That night the knock came. 3 raps. Not on the door, but on the side window of my trailer. Soft. Intentional. I froze in bed, heart pounding. I live alone. Nearest neighbor is 3 miles down the road. Porch light was already on. I grabbed the shotgun and stepped outside. Nothing. No footprints in the frost, no rustle in the trees. But on the mat lay a gift. A shard of deer antler, worn smooth, tied with a bough of red thread. I called Caleb again. This time he brought his own rifle. We sat in the living room, mugs of coffee cooling in our hands, both of us staring at the treeling. Around 3 in the morning, we heard it. Not footsteps, not voices. Singing, low droning, like a dozen tones braided together, rising from the thicket behind the shed. It wasn't words, but it wasn't random either. A pattern too deliberate to be wind. Caleb half stood, ready to walk out. I grabbed his arm and hissed, "Don't." By dawn, the sound had stopped. That afternoon, I bought 6 trail cameras. Top-shelf infrared, 30-yard detection. I mounted them around the cabin, 2 more along the service road. The next morning, every camera showed the same thing. A clean glitch at 3:19 a.m., 11 seconds of static, then a handful of frozen frames. Figures. Too tall, limbs bent wrong. One paused at the porch, its arms long and heavy, hands brushing the ground. Another, pale and hairless, crawled along the woodpile, mouth stretched too wide, teeth shining in the infrared. I sent the files to Charleston. They sent back, firmware malfunction, please reinstall. I never answered. The following night, the song returned. Louder this time, almost rhythmic, like chanting without words. I fired into the trees out of desperation. The sound cut off instantly, but then the footsteps began. Pacing, measured, just beyond the light. They circled for hours, deliberate, as if marking territory. By dawn, I felt hollowed out. Still, I forced myself up to the repeater the next day. I don't know what I expected. Maybe normalcy. Instead, the tower was laced from base to top in red thread. Every rung, every handhold, tied neat with bows. The access panel hung open, and inside was a pile of birds. Not torn apart, not eaten, arranged, stacked, eyes missing. That was the last time I climbed Brush Mountain. I quit the same afternoon, no excuse offered. Someone else was assigned the post. 2 weeks later, his truck was found idling at the trailhead. ATV gone. He never came back. Now I rent an apartment above a laundromat in Beckley. Cars on the street, neighbors on either side. I hear noise every night, arguments, televisions, the groan of pipes, and it comforts me in a way I'd never thought noise could. But sometimes around 3 in the morning, I wake to the faintest sound. Not knocks, not singing, just the threadbare scrape of something wrapping around wood, knotting itself tighter, waiting for me to listen. I'm not a welder, not some heavy machinery guy. I'm 33, an adjunct history instructor who can't seem to land a tenure-track position. My specialty is Appalachian folklore and early colonial settlements, which I figured would make me sound unique in academia. Instead, it just got me underpaid teaching night classes at a community college near Johnson City, waiting for one of the real professors to retire or die. When my contract fell through last year, I decided to take a break before reapplying. A colleague half-jokingly told me I ought to immerse myself in the stories if I wanted my work to stand out. I think she meant spending more time in archives, but I took it literally. I packed what little savings I had and rented a cabin near Cades Cove, past Townsend, on the edge of the Smokies. It wasn't a tourist-friendly spot, no tidy log cabins with rocking chairs, no rental hot tubs under the stars. This was a squat, single-wide with its siding buckling in places, and a porch that tilted like a shipwreck. The owner, some guy named Harvey who supposedly lived down in Maryville, let it out cheap because the access road scared most people off. He said, "Nobody sticks it out long past the first month, but if you're looking for quiet, it's perfect." The quiet was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. The gravel road made me uneasy. It narrowed into a track barely wide enough for one car, twisting through oak and poplar stands that grew so close together they looked braided. The cabin itself sat maybe 6 miles off the main road, and behind it rose a wall of forest that locals just called the Backstep. That name didn't make sense to me, but when I asked the gas station clerk about it, she said, "Don't go down the step. That's all." And she wouldn't explain further. At first, it felt like the solitude I'd craved. I'd cook my beans and cornbread, sip cheap whiskey, and read until the kerosene lamp started sputtering. The phone signal was gone completely. If I needed to make a call, I had to drive back out to the bend near the old mill ruins. I thought the isolation would help me focus, maybe even give me material for a paper or a book. But the forest behind the cabin had a presence I didn't expect. It wasn't just dense, it was wrong. The trees there didn't sway with the wind like the others. They stood stiff, as if locked into place. The space between their trunks looked darker than shadow should allow, like the sun never touched that soil. At noon one day, I stood on the edge and shined my flashlight into it, curious. The beam should have cut across leaves, bark, branches. Instead, it vanished into the black, swallowed hole. I felt embarrassed afterward, like I'd shown the light into a mouth. The first real incident came after my second week. I came back from town with groceries and noticed the front porch light was out. I'd left it on deliberately. The cord wasn't frayed or weathered, it had been cut. Clean, almost surgical. I crouched down to study the end, my skin prickling, and told myself it was vandalism, maybe some hunter messing with the outsider. I replaced the wiring the next day. That night, though, I dreamed of someone knocking at the door in a slow, steady rhythm. Two knocks, pause, two knocks, pause. When I woke up, my hands were clenched so tight around the bedsheet I'd torn a hole in it. By the third week, the knocking wasn't just a dream. It happened in reality, every night around 3 in the morning. Always two knocks, silence, then two more. I never opened the door. I sat there at the kitchen table gripping the heavy candlestick I used as a weapon, my ears straining. The sound wasn't frantic. It wasn't an animal. It was patient. One morning, I stepped outside and found a rock on the porch. Perfectly smooth, perfectly round, river polished. Except there wasn't a river within 10 miles of where I was. The rock was warm in my hand, too warm, and I dropped it almost immediately. I flung it into the trees and told myself not to think about it. That afternoon, I drove into town and stopped at Caleb's place, a friend I'd known since grad school, who'd moved back to his family land in Walland. I spilled everything, even laughed a little nervously while I told it, hoping he'd join in and tease me. But Caleb didn't smile. He went quiet, rummaged in a drawer, and pulled out a little tin wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were bones, small ones, probably rabbit, and bits of red thread. Wax had been poured over them, hard and glossy. It looked ceremonial, wrong, older than the both of us. "Leave it at the edge," Caleb said. His voice was flat. "Don't talk to it, don't look back. Just set it where the light ends." I stared at him. "You believe this?" "I believe what happens when people don't." That evening, before the sun dipped, I carried the tin out to where the meadow grass ended and the back step began. You could literally see the sunlight give up, the way brightness refused to cross that line of trees. My throat tightened. I crouched and set the tin down, trying not to look too deep into the black. That night, there was no knocking. No dreams either. I almost convinced myself the ritual had worked, that it was just local superstition appeased. Days went by in uneasy calm. Then came Sunday. I was stacking wood out back when I noticed movement just beyond the line of trees. At first I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. Something crouched low among the trunks, half concealed, its limbs bent at angles no animal's joints should allow. The skin looked stretched, translucent, as though it had been pulled tight over sticks. Its head tilted too far, smooth where features should be, except for two hollows darker than shadow. I backed toward the cabin, my pulse hammering. Once inside, I slammed the lock and yanked every curtain shut. The rest of the evening I sat in the dark, candle stub trembling in my hand. The next morning, the tin was back on the porch. This time it was surrounded by 4 stones, river polished but painted red, arranged in a square. I didn't touch them. I didn't even step close. I grabbed my keys, drove to Caleb's, and told his wife when he wasn't home. Her face went pale. She said, "You need to leave that place." "I signed a lease," I said, desperate for rational ground. "Then break it," she told me, "because if you don't, they'll break you." I slept on her couch that night. When Caleb got back, he didn't even scold me. He just said, "We'll get your things tomorrow." We drove out the next morning. The cabin stank before we even opened the door. Rot, wet earth, something that belonged in a grave. Every cabinet stood open, dishes shattered, drawers emptied. The fridge door gaped wide, its contents slick with black mold. Worst of all, the motion light I'd installed over the back door was gone. Not smashed, not broken. Gone. The fixture, the wires, even the mounting plate. Like it had been erased. I didn't go back after that. I left most of my things behind, books, clothes, half my research notes. Harvey never called about the deposit, and I never asked. But here's the part one never tell anyone when they ask why I won't go camping anymore. 2 months later, in my new apartment back in town, I woke up at 3 in the morning. My fridge hummed, the clock ticked, but something else cut through the normal sounds. 2 knocks. Silence. Then 2 more. And on my windowsill, behind the curtain I'd left cracked open, lay a single stone. Round, river smooth, painted red. My name's Daniel. I'm 35, a surveyor by trade, though truth be told most of my career has been spent bouncing between short-term gigs that never last more than a season. Mapping parcels of land, clearing access routes, marking lines for pipelines or forestry projects. None of it glamorous, none of it permanent. I started moving around after my divorce and never stopped. You take the work where it comes, and when the contract ends, you pack your truck and drift to the next town. 3 summers back, I landed a job out near the Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area, straddling the Kentucky-Tennessee border. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled onto. A latticework of ravines, sandstone cliffs, and forests so heavy it drowned the sky. The company wanted new access roads scouted through the backwoods. They needed people who could handle long days in the heat with a compass and a GPS unit, folks who didn't mind sleeping in the sticks. It paid well, offered a per diem, and didn't ask questions. That was enough for me. When I arrived, management laid out two options for lodging. One was a set of trailers parked in a gravel clearing near the staging lot. Dozen men jammed together, paper-thin walls, diesel generators thumping through the night. The other was a handful of older shacks and hunting cabins the company had leased from locals. They were scattered deeper in the hills, tucked away along forgotten logging roads. For a fee, you could take one of those and live alone. I didn't hesitate. I'd sooner fight the wilderness than sleep 6 feet from strangers who snore and stink. They gave me the key to a cabin down in a hollow, 3 miles off the county road. The drive-in felt like slipping into a tunnel, oak, pine, and sycamore crowding the gravel until branches scraped both sides of the truck. By the time I found the place, the light was dying, and I realized how far gone I really was. The cabin sagged on cinder blocks, its roof patched with tar paper, porch half collapsed. Still, it had 4 walls, a roof, and space enough to breathe. After years of motels and trailers, that was luxury. The first couple of weeks blurred together in sweat and exhaustion. 12 hours on the job, cutting through brush, marking slopes, noting water crossings, then stumbling back after dark, too sore to care about anything but a can of beans and a mattress. At night, the hollow was black as tar. No traffic hum, no porch lamps in the distance, not even the glow of a farmhouse. Just my cabin lamp burning inside that bowl of trees, a lone speck of light swallowed whole. The silence pressed in so thick it felt alive. At first, I thought it was just the quiet playing tricks on me, but after a while, I started noticing things that didn't fit. One evening I came back from town to find the front light out. I'd left it on that morning, habit. The bulb hadn't burned out. The cord had been cut, sliced neat like someone ran a blade through the rubber. I crouched with it in my hand, the skin on my arms prickling. There was no sign of trespass, no tracks, no forced latch, but I couldn't shake the sense of being tampered with. I rewired it the next day and told myself it was vandals. But it didn't stop there. A week later, I woke at 2:47 a.m. to a sharp sound. 3 knocks on the wall beside my bed. Not the roof popping or a branch scraping. Knuckles. Deliberate. Then a pause. Then 3 more. I lay rigid, staring at the dark ceiling, every nerve screaming. I wanted to believe it was a dream until I saw the glass at sunrise. 2 wide smears, pale and greasy, pressed into the window. Handprints. But not right. The palms were too flat, the fingers too long, stretched as if joints had no end. I said nothing to the crew. Men on those jobs eat each other alive for weakness, and I wasn't about to hand them ammunition. But word must have leaked somehow, because one of the older hands, an Appalachian local named Vernon, cornered me during lunch. He didn't joke, didn't sneer. He just asked, "You keeping your curtains shut?" When I blinked at him, confused, he said, "Do it, and don't whistle after dark." Then he walked off. The next night, I caught movement from the porch. At first I thought it was a black bear, hulking on the slope. But bears don't walk smooth on 2 legs. This shape did. Tall, broad, sliding between the tree trunks, as if it knew every root and rock by heart. It stopped halfway up the rise and turned. I couldn't see a face, not in that dark, but I felt the weight of it land square on me. A cold, deliberate attention. I raised a hand, half ready to shout, half ready to wave, but before I could, it pivoted and drifted back into the trees. Sleep abandoned me after that. Every creak, every pop of the wood stove set me bolt upright. 2 nights later, I found a rabbit on my porch, laid out stiff as lumber. Its throat torn, eyes missing, legs stretched perfectly straight. Not kill, not hunger. Arrangement. A message. I hurled it into the brush and scrubbed my hands raw with soap. That was when the pacing started. Just after 2 each night, footsteps circled the cabin. Slow, steady. Not rushing, not sneaking. Measuring. Every loop paused at the corners, as if testing the structure, mapping it. Once, it stopped at the door long enough that the handle gave a faint rattle. I pressed my back against it, knife shaking in my hand, until dawn finally pried me loose. Morning brought new gifts. Stones, river-worn round, set in precise lines across the threshold. 7 of them, evenly spaced, gleaming with dew. I hadn't touched them, hadn't even dared step close, when Vernon caught me again at the sight. He chewed his tobacco, squinted at me, and said, "If the stones come, you're marked." I asked what he meant. He spat in the dirt, glanced around to make sure nobody else was listening, and finally muttered, "Laurel children." I frowned, waiting, but he didn't elaborate until I pressed. He said there used to be a homestead deep in those ridges, a family nobody in town much liked. Claimed the hills as theirs, lived cut off for years. Folks whispered they'd traded something in the woods for protection. Game in their traps, crops that never failed, sickness that skipped their cabin. Then one winter, their place burned. Nobody survived, least not in a way you'd want to. The sheriff found bones scattered in the creek, not all of them human. The rest vanished. And after that, people said shapes roamed the hollows at night. Long-limbed, pale, faceless. The children of Laurel, come to take back what was theirs. You stay in that hollow much longer, Vernon told me. They'll finish marking you. I tried to laugh it off, but it clung to me. That night I pulled every curtain tight, left every lamp blazing, and sat awake with my knife across my lap. Around 2, the door handle turned again. This time it didn't stop. The latch clicked back and forth, slow, curious, like fingers exploring. Then the wood bowed inward with a groan, pressure building. Not forcing, testing, as if waiting for me to open. I didn't move until sunrise. When I finally cracked the door, the yard was empty. No tracks, no prints. But the stones had been changed, stacked into a tower, balanced so carefully a breeze should have toppled it. I packed that afternoon. Left most of my gear, didn't care about the deposit. Told the manager I wanted reassignment. Any site, any bunkhouse, didn't matter. I drove straight through the night, 10 hours without stopping, until neon vacancy signs welcomed me back to civilization. I thought distance would break the spell, that whatever lingered in those ridges would stay bound to its trees. But 2 months later, in a cheap apartment outside Lexington, I woke to a sound at 3 a.m. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. I froze, every nerve remembering the hollow. My breath fogged in the air, though the heat was on. I forced myself to the window. On the sill, balanced with impossible care, sat 7 stones. Perfect. River polished, and painted red. My name's Aaron, I'm 34, and for the past decade I've worked as a field inspector for a civil engineering outfit that contracts across the Appalachians. Most of my jobs are forgettable, checking old bridges, mapping culverts, verifying easements. It's dull work but steady, and it keeps me outdoors, which I prefer. In late September 2 years ago, I got an assignment down in the Cumberland Plateau, near a stretch folks call Black Hollow. I didn't know much about the place, only that it sat at the tail end of Scott County, Virginia, where the roads thinned out to little more than logging tracks. The company flagged it as a record discrepancy. That happens sometimes. Maps don't line up with field reality. A structure shows up where it shouldn't, or coordinates get lost in the shuffle. My task was simple: drive out, confirm what stood there, and update the system. In and out. When I picked up the work order at the office, something caught my eye. Under notes, there was a tag, Legacy Site, uncatalogued. Use caution. I asked dispatch what that meant. They shrugged. Old record. Maybe a hunting shack. Just document it, take a photo, move on. I've learned not to argue with easy money, so I tossed my gear in the truck and headed out. The drive took me past little hamlets I'd never seen on any map, clusters of rusted trailers, sagging barns, yards overrun with broken tractors and dogs that looked half wild. At the last gas station, the clerk told me cell service would drop dead after 5 miles. He wasn't lying. By the time I turned down the gravel spur toward Black Hollow, my phone had gone flat. The road narrowed, weaving through hickory and pine so thick they blocked the sky. Ruts grabbed at the tires. I rolled the window down to push aside a branch, and that was when I noticed the quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but a blanket silence. No cicadas, no woodpeckers, not even wind stirring the leaves. The path dipped into a bowl of trees, and there it was, a house. 2 stories, pitched roof, weathered siding gray as ash. No grass, just bare earth scoured clean like nothing had grown there in years. A porch slumped along the front, half collapsed. The windows were open holes, black inside. Yet on the post above the steps burned a porch lamp, steady, warm. I parked at the edge of the clearing, unease already tugging at my gut. The job was the job, though, so I grabbed my clipboard and walked up. The door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, older, hair white and pinned back, eyes cloudy with cataracts. But she was sharp, too sharp. Her posture was rigid, her face unreadable. "You came for the line," she said. I hesitated, then nodded. "Got a report about power. Said it's been out." She tilted her head, like she was considering my words. 4 days. Just now came back on." Then she stepped aside. Inside, the house was strangely clean. Hand-woven rugs, shelves lined with jars of dried plants, a cast-iron stove that gave off faint heat. No TV, no clock, nothing modern except a single lamp flickering like it was fed by weak current. The air smelled of earth and smoke. "Breaker box?" I asked. "Follow the wire," she said, and sat down in a tall-backed chair by the fire. Out back, I found the line. It wasn't attached to any proper pole. Instead, someone had lashed peeled logs together with iron nails driven crooked and mounted a battered fuse box to it. The cable had been cut clean like by shears. I spliced it, closed the lid, tested the current. It flowed fine, but when I glanced back, she wasn't on the porch anymore. She was upstairs, framed in a broken window, watching me, unmoving. I forced myself to finish, then went back in to confirm. The lamps inside were glowing, but the light was strange, not steady, not electrical. It pulsed like it was breathing. "You fixed it," she said, voice thin. Then she smiled in a way that made my stomach twist. "They'll notice now." "Who?" I asked. Her gaze never left the fire. "You best leave before dark." I didn't argue. I got into the truck and threw it in reverse, gravel spitting under the tires. But as I pushed down the road, the trees pressed closer, branches clawing at the paint. I checked the mirror once, then again. The trail behind me looked exactly the same as the one ahead, no matter how far I drove. For a sick moment, I thought I was trapped in a loop. Then the engine died. Everything went black, dashboard, headlights, radio. Dead silent. I climbed out, heart hammering, popped the hood. Battery looked fine. No smoke, no smell. That was when I heard it, dragging. Not footsteps, something heavy pulled across wet leaves. It circled unseen, slow, deliberate. Then my truck blazed to life. Every light switched on at once, flooding the trees. The radio shrieked alive, first static, then a storm of voices layered together, rapid, overlapping. Not English. Not any language I'd ever heard. My hand shook as I yanked the knob, but the sound only grew louder. I ran. I don't know why I didn't stay in the truck. I bolted straight back through the trees, branches whipping my face. The noise followed me, static searing, until I stumbled into the clearing again. The house waited, porch light burning steady, door wide open. I don't know what compelled me, but I went inside. The chair by the fire was empty. The stove was cold. Upstairs, a single door was closed, painted black, edges cracked. Behind it, sound. A wet rhythm like something chewing. Then a laugh. Childlike, but broken, the way a tape sounds when it warps. I backed away, but the hall light snapped out. The air pressed in. The door cracked open by itself, just enough to show pale limbs unfurling across the floor. Long wrong, joints bending backward. I bolted, fell against the banister, tore down the stairs. Through the clearing, through the trees, until my lungs felt ready to burst. When I stumbled back into the road, my truck was waiting, idling, lights normal. Door wide open. I drove until the tires hit asphalt, and didn't stop until I was 3 towns away. I filed no report. Told the office the coordinates were bad, nothing there. But 2 weeks later, a new ticket came in from the same sector. Same tag, legacy site, uncatalogued. Proceed with caution. I deleted it. That night, at 3 a.m., I woke to silence. Too deep, too heavy. From the corner of my dark apartment came 3 slow knocks. And in the thin sliver of light from the blinds, I saw a shadow stretch, too long for the walls that contained it. I'm 41, and until a couple of years ago, I worked as a cartographer for a small firm that specialized in old boundary disputes. Most of my jobs involved combing through court records, walking fence lines, and updating deeds. Nothing romantic about it, nothing dangerous, just miles of hiking with a pack, a GPS, and a notebook. I liked it though. I liked the quiet repetition of it. If you walk long enough in the woods, the chatter in your head eventually thins out. And for me that silence was better than therapy. In late autumn, I took a contract that sent me deep into the Monongahela National Forest, along the West Virginia side of the border, where the ridges pile up and the maps start to contradict one another. The county wanted a survey done on a tract no one seemed able to pin down. Some swore it had been logged out in the 60s, others said it was never touched. My job was to walk it, mark its corners, and resolve the records. I didn't question why the job was so cheap for the hours they were asking. Remote work paid extra, and I needed the money. The forest road to the site turned worse the farther I went. Asphalt gave way to gravel, gravel to dirt, dirt to a set of ruts crawling with wet leaves. I drove for nearly an hour without passing another vehicle. When I finally reached the coordinates, there was nothing. No cabins, no markers, not even a proper trailhead. Just a wall of sycamore and laurel rising steep from the ditch. My instructions had said there was a cabin I could use as a field base. Sure enough, when I hiked a half-mile in, I found it. It leaned against the hillside like it was trying to crawl back into the dirt, the roof sagging, the porch bowing. But the door was unlocked, and inside it was furnished more neatly than I expected. A wood stove, a table, a cot, shelves stocked with canned food long past expiration. A lantern sat in the window, already trimmed with oil. It looked abandoned, but not ruined. It looked kept. The first week passed in the rhythm I'd hoped for. I marked corners, flagged tree lines, measured stream beds. The woods were dense, but alive. Squirrels rattled branches overhead, woodpeckers drummed, the usual chorus of frogs and insects sang at night. It was exactly the solitude I'd craved. Then, during the second week, the silence arrived. It didn't roll in gradually like a weather front. It hit all at once. I woke one night and realized the forest was mute. No insects, no owls, no shifting leaves. Just a kind of blank pressure, as though the air itself had thickened. I lay in the cot, ears straining, and that was when the knock came. Not at the door. At the back wall, directly behind my headboard. One solid rap, deliberate. A pause. Then another, softer. I sat up, lantern light shaking against the boards. My knife was already in my hand. I waited like that until gray dawn seeped through the window. In the daylight, I checked the wall. No prints. No scratches. The ground outside was soft from rain, but there were no tracks. I circled the cabin twice, uneasy. That afternoon I walked farther than usual, trying to lose the dread in my legs. But when I came back, I found the lantern in the window burning. I hadn't lit it. The next morning, reviewing the photos on my GPS unit, I saw something wrong. I'd set the device on a timer the day before, snapping pictures every 15 minutes as I walked the line. In one frame, along the edge of a clearing, there was movement, pale and crooked. I zoomed in. It was shaped like a person but crawling flat, belly dragging, arms stretched far longer than they should be. The head was turned away, pressed against the leaves. In the next frame, only minutes later, the clearing was empty. I returned to the spot, hoping for tracks. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed, as if no one had crossed it at all. That night I barricaded the door with the table and kept the lantern burning. Around 2 a.m, the knocking returned. This time it came from different walls. 2 taps at the far side, then 3 on the door, then a dragging scratch down the boards. Not fast, not random, like something mapping the cabin, testing its boundaries. When I finally dozed near dawn, I woke to the door standing wide open. My supplies were untouched, but every drawer was pulled out, every shelf cleared and left on the floor. The papers I'd stacked neatly were spread across the table in spirals, as if someone had dragged their hand in circles. I hiked to the nearest ranger station that afternoon, 2 hours down twisting roads. I told the man at the desk someone was trespassing near the cabin, maybe squatting out there. He gave me a look I didn't understand, then said, "Ain't nobody living in that tract. Not anymore." I asked what he meant. He shook his head. "Best pack up before the ridge takes notice." I didn't know what to do with that, so I drove back. The next day's blurred. I checked my markers, swapped out batteries, tried to pretend the job mattered more than the gnawing weight in my chest. One evening, just before dark, I found a ring of stones on the porch, 7 of them, river smooth and round, laid perfectly in a circle. In the middle sat one of my survey stakes, broken in half. That night I woke to voices. Faint at first, drifting through the timber, rising and falling like wind. I couldn't catch the words, but I knew the cadence. Laughter. Then my name, whispered in a child's pitch. I pressed my palms to my ears until they went silent. The next morning, bones were waiting in place of the stones. Small ones, bleached white, arranged with care. That was when I remembered a story an old professor had told once, in a lecture I'd half slept through. He said the Monongahela ridges had legends older than the English deeds we trusted, tales of pale surveyors that came before the maps. Spirits that marked land not for people but for themselves. When boundaries were challenged, they came crawling to redraw them in bone and ash. I lasted one more night. Around 3, the lantern blew out though the window was shut. The silence deepened. Then the boards above me groaned, as though something crawled across the roof. The weight shifted to the porch, then to the door. The latch clicked. Slow. Testing. I didn't wait. I shoved the table aside, bolted through the trees with my pack half open, stumbling until my legs cramped. I don't remember reaching the truck, only the relief of asphalt under the tires as I sped until the mountains fell behind me. I never filed the survey. The company closed the project a month later, archived without comment. Now I work in an office in Charleston, drawing parcels I never set foot on. But sometimes around 3 in the morning, I wake to silence so heavy it pins me down. And in the hush, from the wall behind my bed, comes a knock. Just one. For now. I'm 37, an environmental surveyor for hire, which mostly means people pay me to tramp through woods they'll never set foot in, and tell them what they can't build there. Logging outfits, developers, even conservation groups, they all want reports. Over the years I've crawled through swamps, hiked ridgelines with 100-pound packs, even mapped stream beds in midwinter with ice forming on my waders. I've always been able to handle solitude. I actually prefer it. So when I say something rattled me to my bones, I don't mean I got spooked by coyotes or lost my nerve at shadows. I mean it was wrong, in a way I still can't explain. This was in 2006, during a contract that brought me to a forgotten corner of southern West Virginia, not far from the Tug Fork. A land broker wanted a full assessment of a parcel there, supposedly for a rustic retreat project. They pitched it as some kind of eco-friendly campground scheme. I'd been in worse thickets for less money, so I agreed. 3 days of solo fieldwork, GPS coordinates, flagging unusual features. Standard. The road started paved, narrowed to gravel, then turned to a dirt track carved between ridges, so steep the sun disappeared by mid-afternoon. I didn't pass another car for over an hour. At the trailhead, there was nothing, no signage, no evidence anyone had been there in decades. I rode the last stretch on foot, gear clanking in my pack, until I found a clearing big enough to pitch a tent. A creek trickled nearby, and the air smelled of damp leaves. At first glance, it felt perfect, remote, silent, mind a catalog. The first day went smooth. I mapped slopes, logged soil types, sketched a few odd rock outcroppings. Toward evening I came across something that snagged my attention. Half buried in moss at the base of a ridge was a stone post about knee-high. Not squared like a survey marker, not natural either. It was rounded at the top, its surface carved with shallow grooves. The lines weren't letters, at least not in any language I recognized. They coiled in spirals and sharp angles, almost like someone had pressed a blade in at random and then smoothed the stone with bare hands. It looked impossibly old, yet the marks were crisp. I logged its coordinates, snapped a photo, and moved on, chalking it up to some forgotten grave marker. But as dusk fell, I felt the unease start to creep. That night, while boiling water on my little stove, a sound carried from the trees. Not the pat of deer or the crash of bear. This was deliberate, slower. A dragging noise, like a wet log being hauled over soil. It paused, started again, and seemed to circle at a distance. I grabbed my flashlight, swept the beam through the dark, and saw nothing. The forest stood still, every branch motionless, as if holding its breath. The sound cut off clean the instant my light hit the tree line. In the morning, I found a neat ring of stones laid just beyond the edge of camp. They were small river-smooth rocks, none of which I'd noticed the day before. In the center lay a piece of bark, stripped pale, and carved with the same spiral-eyed scene on the stone marker. It looked freshly etched, edges sharp. I sealed it in a sample bag out of instinct, though I didn't want to touch it at all. I hiked farther the second day, threading through thickets and climbing over shale outcrops. About a mile east, I found another carved stone, nearly identical to the first. This one sat hidden under laurels, so dense I nearly missed it. When I brushed away leaves, I swore the rock felt faintly warm, though the canopy overhead kept the place in shadow. That night I strung a perimeter line, nylon cord with tin cans, the old field trick to warn if anything passed through. I'd used it dozens of times. At midnight, every can rattled at once. Not a breeze, not one or two, but the entire line. I stumbled out with my headlamp and knife, scanning every angle. The cord wasn't broken by wind or deer hooves. It was cut, clean, each strand sliced like by scissors. I moved camp at dawn, half a mile south along the creek. Told myself I'd finish the job, log the points, and head out early. But unease settled into my skin. By midday I noticed claw marks raked across a poplar trunk, where parallel gouges set 6 feet high. They weren't bare marks, I've seen plenty. These were too smooth, too deliberate, tapering as if carved with careful precision. When I laid my palm against one groove, it radiated a warmth that didn't belong to any tree. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright in the tent with the lantern burning, blade across my lap. Around 2, a sound drifted close. Not footsteps, not animals, a whisper. It circled the canvas low to the ground, breath shaped almost into words. I could make out cadence, not meaning. At times it nearly formed laughter. At times it nearly said my name. My throat tightened until I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged outside with the lamp. The forest was empty, except for movement, quick as a blink, slipping between 2 trees. I followed, stumbling through brush until I reached a trunk marked with another spiral, carved deep and fresh. Beneath it, a smear of blood ran down the bark. Not much, but enough to shine wet in my light. My chest seized. I turned to retrace my path back to camp, only to find myself standing in the same clearing I'd left. Same logs, same broken branch. My compass needle spun without direction. Somehow, I'd circled back without turning. Whispers swelled again, this time directly behind me. When I spun, nothing stood there. The woods lay still, but the air pressed heavy as water. I didn't wait. I ran until my lungs burned. I left my second camp behind, crashed downhill in a straight line until my knees buckled against stone. I huddled beneath a ledge until dawn with the knife gripped so tight my palms split. By late morning, I stumbled onto a narrow path. It was too neat to be game trail, graded by hand long ago. At its end stood a shed, leaning and padlocked, boards gray with rot. A stake in the ground bore a laminated tag, stamped with the company name that had hired me. But the lettering looked off, almost smudged. When I later searched, that company didn't exist. No registry, no phone number, no trace it ever had. I backtracked until I reached a dirt road, where by pure luck I ran into an old man carrying a rifle and a string of squirrels. He didn't ask questions, just gave me a lift to the nearest town. When I tried to send my report later, every file came back corrupted. The photos showed nothing but blurred static. The sample bag with the carved bark was gone from my pack, though I never removed it. I dug into records and found no trace of the contract. The email address had vanished, the website shuttered. I told myself to forget. I took other jobs closer to towns, in places where people still lived and worked. But sometimes, in the black hours past midnight, I waked to the sound of stones clicking together, 3 sharp clacks, a pause, then 3 more. It comes from outside my window. I don't open the curtains anymore.